welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ulrike Ziegler. I guess many of you who have dialed in know me already. I'm on the board of Impact on Sustainable Aviation, and together with ISTAT, we're co-hosting today's webinar on heading to net zero, rerouting aviation's technology transition. But firstly, before we dig in, let me thank ISTAT a lot for collaborating on a critical topic. And the topic is, which is at the very core of aviation's license to operate, transitioning aviation to becoming a more sustainable industry. As Impact, what we would like to do with our work is facilitate the transition of aviation through building cross-stakeholder networks, fostering know-how, and sharing best practices. And by doing that, we're convinced we can address some of the big challenges, which are credibility. We need to risk manage. We need to have a transparency across the industry, but also we need to talk about mobilization of capital for decarbonization technologies. Talking about capital very briefly on the background of Impact members, our activities are deeply rooted in finance, and it's fair to say that finance is the center of gravity. Not only do we finance the very core needs of our airline and lessor friends, but it's also about mobilizing and unlocking substantial amounts of investments for decarbonization that aids the transition. Talking about transition, this is not all about the money. And just to set the scene, I guess, for today's webinar, I think the last couple of months have shown that we're off to a bit of a bumpy ride when it comes to transition, right? The EU's omnibus package will significantly ease sustainability-related reporting requirements, in particular for aircraft lessors. We see mounting concerns over pace and scale of ESAF mandates in the EU. Companies leave Net Zero Banking Alliance, SBTI, Airbus delaying its hydrogen ambitions, and the US administration is reducing support for carbon capture. But on the positive side, we've also seen an ESAF plant in Germany, in Aerotech, commencing operations, and Infinium as a plant in the US reaching FID. But I think what that overview actually makes abundantly clear, the new normal is very complex. We need more than technological breakthrough and money. We need a coordinated and resilient stakeholder ecosystem that can actually respond to shifting in policies, markets, and investment signals, as I just highlighted. And I guess we also need to be very open to continuously reassess our direction, adapt where necessary, and remain open to evolving strategies and having a plan B. And this is nothing short of a great challenge for Michael from MUFG, who's moderating the panel, and our wonderful panelists, to walk us through their thoughts on today's topic, heading to net zero. Over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Ulrike. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. It looks like we have a very good turnout. We will talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will open it to Q&A. So please be sure to post your question. And while I am moderating, I will also try to look at the questions and see which ones we can get to in time. So let's start off. So I'm Michael Hallaby. I'm at MUFG Bank. I also sit on the board of Impact. I'm also a committee member of the Sustainability Committee at ISTAT. So thank you to both groups for putting on today's event. Very, very thrilled to have the panelists that we have today. Some very high-ranking, well-known caliber speakers. I will try to keep them in line. Let's see. Let me start off with Jonathan Council, who's the group head of sustainability at IAG. He's been in that role and I'll let the panelists each introduce themselves. We have Dan Rutherford, who's a senior director of research at ICCT, one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent, transportation think tank. Very constructive approach they take to aviation. We have Sandrine Lacour from, the product marketing general manager at CFM, the engine manufacturer. And we have Julian Renz from Zero Avia, head of programs. So what we'll do is I'm going to try to follow the old BBC tagline of inform, educate, and entertain. We'll see how far we get on the entertainment part, but I would like to thank again everybody for joining, both the attendees as well as my fellow panelists. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Jonathan for a brief introduction. We will then go into some strategic questions, and we'll get down into more specific questions with each of the panelists. But I'll start with you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Michael. And great to be able to join you this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I actually have a new title, Group Sustainability Director.
Thank you.
So same pay, but new title.
And Battlefield promotion. Battlefield promotion, I think that's called.
Exactly. And yeah, so those that don't know, we have the 5 airlines: British Airways, Aer Lingus, Iberia, Vueling, and Level. And just a bit of background, we were happy to get the ball rolling. First airline to commit to net zero emissions by 2050 back in October 2019. And great to see that now. I still think I'm right in saying that we're the only sector that are committed both at the industry level and government level to net zero emissions by 2050. So that's great, but it's all about delivery. We'll no doubt get into talk a bit about sustainable aviation fuels. We committed to 10% by 2030, and happy to talk about where we are with that during the conversation.
Great, thank you. How about Dan? You next, please.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and great to be here with everyone. So obviously, I work at the International Council on Clean Transportation. For those of you who don't know the ICCT, we work directly with environmental regulators worldwide to set the best environmental standards for all modes of transport. Kind of our calling card is the first work that my colleagues in the Berlin office did on helping uncover the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. But that's sort of example of the work that we do and the role that we play in bringing transparency to emissions in the transportation sector. Yeah, really pleased to be with you today. I started ICCT's aviation program back in 2008 and have been working over the years on a variety of emissions issues, starting with helping design the first aircraft CO2 standard that was set at the UN level. More recently, been doing a lot of work on technology roadmaps for net zero aviation, and then some voluntary efforts that I think are important, including work on the Science-Based Target Initiative's aviation pathway. And then most recently, a project I'm really happy about, helping advise Google Flights and other travel booking platforms on how to provide the most accurate and precise emissions estimates to consumers at the time of purchasing tickets. So yeah, very happy to be with you today.
Great, thank you, Dan. Sandrine?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Sandrine Lacour. I currently lead the French side of the CFM product marketing team. And I've got an engineering background in aerodynamics, so I naturally started my career designing engine airfoils before transitioning to the sales and marketing department, where I held various positions. And I've been actively involved in sustainability-related topic for several years now.
Great, thank you, Sandrine. And do we have Julian? It seems like we might have lost Julian. Have we recovered Julian? We've not yet recovered Julian. So why don't we kickstart? We'll get Julian involved once he's back on the line. So let's start with the term rerouting or rerouting, depending on where one learned English. I think as Ulrika mentioned, we've seen some ESG fatigue. We've seen airlines retract or step back from 2030 and 2050 targets. We've seen some banks, including MUFG, leave the Net Zero Banking Alliance. We do stick to our net zero targets, however. And so I'm just wondering, is there a bit of ESG fatigue? Is Jonathan, I'll start with you. Is that something that you witness? Is this something that affects you one way or another? I'd just be curious to know from an airline's point of view how you see this.
Yeah, to some extent we have, and it's certain that ESG has become somewhat politicized in some areas, and erroneously linked to the cost of living crisis was not helpful. We actually saw something quite similar during the global financial crisis back in 2008-11, when many organizations reduced to remove their sustainability teams and also reduce their efforts in this area. But thankfully, I think this time is different. Because I think there's a far greater understanding of the importance of climate change, and that it's actually driven by the science, not by politicians, and that there is a critical underlying imperative, that we just have to do this, and we can't delay, because if we delay, that just makes the challenge even harder. But having said that, there is no doubt it has become more challenging, particularly when it comes to attracting finance, for example, for SAF projects, where we see many investors, they're just adapting a kind of wait and see position due to just massively increased levels of uncertainty in the policy arena. But I'd say overall the aviation industry, we remain fully committed to net zero emissions by 2050. So this was reiterated just at last week's IATA annual general meeting, where the Director General said, look, we are absolutely committed to this ambition, and that's certainly the case also here at IAG. But
Yeah.
that said, there are challenges. Yeah.
We'll get into SAF and pricing in this panel. I think Mr. Walsh also expressed some concerns the way he does about sort of the pricing of it and who's charging who, but we'll see if we can get to that. So Julian is so maybe before I turn it over to Dan's view on the rerouting, Julian, welcome back. We did the introductions. We just started the first question. So Julian, to give a quick summary of a quick introduction of yourself, and then we'll jump into the rest of the first question. Unless Zoom crashed on Julian again.
No, I
go there.
apologize for that. So yeah, my name is Julian. I'm VP Strategy here at ZeroAvia, and been there since the very start. So it's about like kind of 7 years now that we've been pushing hydrogen electric aviation into the market. So yeah, look forward to the panel.
Great, thank you. I might just go back while we stick on this first question rerouting, and I'll come to Julian and Sandrine in a second. But Dan, being at ICCT, is this something you witness as well, a sort of a fatigue, or is this does it sort of continue at pace? I mean, I guess the way that I look at it is, I think aviation decarbonization will continue. It might be a bit slower. Things might change as Jonathan mentioned. It might be a bit more political than otherwise. But at ICCT, is that something that you witness?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, there's this inevitable ebb and flow around all sorts of environmental commitments. And we've seen this over the years. It's one thing to set sort of aspirational or sector-wide goals. It's something very different to agree to the regulations that are needed to support them. So inevitably over the years, we've seen kind of this 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach, where you get sort of big global agreements. And then as governments start to put in place measures to support those, there's inevitably kind of a recognition of the real challenges, the real costs. And so we've seen this over the years. Oftentimes, a climate meeting like Copenhagen or Paris will create this burst of enthusiasm. We'll jump forward 2 steps, and then we'll come back a step once we start to design the regulations. But you also see that in the particulars of how airlines are starting to moderate some of their voluntary targets. To give you a concrete example, we saw a lot of voluntary airline targets to try to achieve 10% SAF use in 2030. Subsequently, the EU proposed its Refuel EU mandate, which is for 6% SAF in 2030. And we have seen some airlines recalibrate their 2030 targets as a result. So I think we're seeing not only the natural sort of ebb and flow of these agreements, but also I think some really constructive and necessary thinking about what can be achieved voluntarily versus what is achievable under like binding mandates.
Okay, right. And I'll turn it over to Sandrine now. I think probably under the guise of new technology, how do you see this sort of rerouting and potential sort of ESG fatigue? Do you see an opportunity for CFM there? Is it more of a challenge?
I mean, I don't think that these announcements that you mentioned change anything for us. I mean, we as an engine OEM, we need to focus on research and technologies, developing and maturing all the technologies to provide a future engine that will be able to first be compliant with 100% SAF when they will be certified, and keep on providing the best technology to reduce the fuel consumption and the CO2 emissions as much as we can. And so the fact that, yeah, there are maybe some bad news, like you mentioned, they refer to Willie Walsh saying that SAF are increasing but disappointingly slowly. This was echoed recently by the EASA executive director saying that, well, there will be probably enough SAF to cover the refuel EU mandate of 6% by 2030. Reaching 20% in 2035 is not guaranteed. So yeah, so there are some headwinds, but I think we should not concentrate on the bad news. We are humans; we tend to focus on the bad news. But for instance, there have been some positive news with the recently the French and the Chinese governments announcing that they will invest hundreds of millions of dollars in SAF production the UK government has set a sort of revenue certainty mechanism, bridging the gap in price between SAF and kerosene. And I think this is really, really positive, and it goes in the right direction. And I do hope that other governments will follow on that. And you referred as well to the US banks leaving the net zero emissions. I think that there's sort of disparity across the world here, some different visions, because if you look at European banks, I find that they are very active in the field of sustainability, supporting various initiatives, including SAF, but not only linked to SAF. And the fact that these banks remain committed, to me, suggests that they recognize that aviation decarbonization is essential. So I think we shouldn't be alerted by some of the bad news, because there are also some good news on the other side of the coin.
Okay, good. And then Julian, I'll turn it over to you. Your new powertrain technology, have you noticed any sort of ESG fatigue? Does that hinder in any way Zero Avia? Is there an opportunity there? And we'll talk a bit more about sort of investors and the like as we go down this panel. But I thought just to start, if you had any particular views.
I mean, first I kind of have to say sorry for your panel, right? Because it seems to be that we're all pretty good optimists here that take the challenge.
I think that's aviation in general.
Work through it.
I think aviation people are generally optimistic.
I'm sure we'll start disagreeing shortly on how we get there exactly, right? But I think, first I just want to underline what Dan said, right? Nothing ever happens in a straight line. In fact, just read a book called Same as Ever, which one of the chapters is exactly that, right? Kind of things go up and down. There's the concept of the hype cycle in startup land specifically, right? Or in the adoption of new technologies. It's 100% what we're going through at the moment. That's totally fine. I think for us, the big opportunity lies in the fact that, when we started Zero Avia, it was already pretty clear that you can't build a business by just promising a greener solution generally. I think, that was our conviction already kind of back then. It needed to be kind of a better solution. And I think what this current wave of, political climate and maybe some business climate as well has shown is just that is truer than ever. Like, you just have to offer a better solution. And we think with what we are developing, it is ultimately, a more cost-effective, a quieter, a cleaner solution. We don't have to focus just on the environmental aspect of it. So yeah, okay. I think it's pretty positive.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's now move to your firm's strategy to decarbonize and whether that has changed in the last few years. And I'd like Jonathan and Sandrine, I think in particular, because you're sort of at the coalface of the technology now, or using that technology. We know that aviation is the famous 2.5% of global emissions. Interestingly enough, in England, where I live and work, aviation emissions now are about 7%, and they're increasing as the rest of British, business decarbonizes faster. For example, they got rid of all the last coal-fired power plant last year, I believe. So maybe, Jonathan, you mentioned a goal of 10% SAF by 2030. I think that's IAG, that's the parent, but also in Britain, the target is 10%, and you've got your flight path to net zero. So is that still going along at pace? Have things changed at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so our top line is, we recognize we're a hard to decarbonize sector, so we need everything. And actually, I'm pleased to say we are an investor in Zero Avia. We think hydrogen fuel cell technology has a role to play. It'll take longer, but it will have a role to play by 2050. But for us, the major role will be played by Sustainable Aviation Fuels. Our view, it's the only solution that can be scaled up in the next 10 years. And fundamentally, it's the only viable solution for long-haul travel, which will represent 70% of our emissions. So yeah, we committed to 10% back in April 2021. So for IAG, that's 1 million tons. The global supply of SAF in 2021 was 100,000 tons. So
some work to do.
We got some sideways looks from people in the company. Are you sure?
I'd say wood to chop, but I don't think that's an appropriate term. But anyway,
but we saw all the momentum around policy moves and so on. Last year, we bought 162,000 tons. So we were, the largest purchaser in the world, and that's 16% of global supply. It's 2% of our SAF. And we are confident that we'll get to the 10% by 2030. And that's largely because we've got the policy that is enabling us to do that, be it the UK mandate, the EU mandate, but importantly, the incentives that go along with that. We know a lot of other carriers have also, I think 60 carriers have committed 10%, about 40% of global capacity, but they're depending on the supported policy they're exposed to will depend very much on whether they're able to deliver to that. But fundamentally, so we need the policy support, but airlines have a critical role to play as well. And for us, this is about providing long-term committed take-or-pay contracts. Now, that's the thing that we can bring to the SAF suppliers that will help them raise the funds to get these plants built. And we really want to encourage other airlines to do that. We can't do it on our own. We need every airline to put in these long-term deals to get this, to help this industry scale up. So the sort of key KPI for us now is how much have we invested in those long-term offtake agreements, and today it sits just above $3.5 billion. And that will increase, and that's what we want other airlines to do as well.
Okay, and Sandrine, obviously you're providing the powertrain, the power behind it, the propulsion, and obviously people argue that we're not decarbonizing fast enough, that things aren't efficient. I think people also have to keep in mind that the engines have improved. I mean, decarbonization of aviation has been much faster than, say, as far as I'm aware, and Dan will probably correct me, but I believe even faster than cars have decarbonized, or the efficiency. So how does that work with you guys? Are you looking to work with, or are you working with some? Imagine you are, but are you working with SAF folks? Are you looking to invest in SAF businesses? How does that come up when you look at new projects and programs?
Yeah, and first to be back on your comment about the fact that aviation has decarbonized quite quickly compared to other sectors. If you look at the narrow-body sector, the short to mid-range aircraft, actually the technologies developed by CFM have been able to reduce CO2 emissions by 40% in 40 years. So it's already a tremendous achievement. We need to go further, obviously. And with regards specifically to your question about what we're doing in terms of SAF, one thing that we are doing, for instance, is that we use SAF at the test benches. It's part of our ambition to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 1 emission. So we started some years ago with 10% SAF, and we will reach 35% during the course of this year. So this is one example. Another example is that we are, when I say we, I refer to the two CFM parent companies, so both GE and Safran. So they invest in some SAF production facilities. For instance, the French side of CFM is supporting or has invested in Aeratech that produces e-fuel. So the kind of activity we can have. And obviously, the latest activity we have about SAF is check their compatibility with the engines, to perform tests with 100% SAF, to measure as well the emissions, the contrails. And this is something that we've done on LEAP engines, for instance, some years ago, both on Airbus and Boeing aircraft. And the idea behind that is obviously to make sure that the engines can work with 100% SAF when they will be certified, make sure that all the materials are compatible. And it's not only about the engine, I would say, because we need to ensure that 100% SAF are compatible with all the equipment around the engine. And last year, there was an announcement that all the OEMs were joining forces to evaluate the compatibility of 100% SAF. And I find this is really positive because it will enable us to go faster than if we are working each of us on our own. So there is some great momentum around on the work about 100% SAF, around their compatibility and their impact on the emissions and on contrast. We need to go further, obviously. We are not there yet, but this is an important area of activity.
Thank you. And actually, let's stick to SAF for a moment, and I'd like to turn it over to Dan. So the number I keep in my head, because just a nice big round number, is 100 billion gallons of SAF used, I believe, last year. So it's just a nice round number, 100 billion. And I think we're expecting to see something like 1.2 billion gallons this year, I believe, and hopefully getting to about 11 billion gallons in 2030. So 11% will probably be less because more aircraft will be flying. I mean, do you view that, based on what you see, do you view that as realistic to see up to 11 billion gallons? Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think it's going to be affordable to airlines to do so? Be curious to know what you think.
Yeah.
Willie Walsh last week, sorry, so Willie Walsh last week was quite critical, I think, of some of the producers, but anyway.
Yes. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Just to check, I think probably you meant to say 100 million gallons, scaling up to
Sorry,
1.2
yes,
billion. But yeah,
correct.
so significant scale up. I mean, we are seeing rapid expansion in SAF right now, but it's overwhelmingly in HEFA fuels, so hydro processed fuels. And we do believe that HEFA fuels have a role to play in all of this, but their supply is limited. There's only so
It's
much
also
used.
questionable.
It's also often used for other applications already, like in road transport. So there are questions about the value of diverting an existing resource just to aviation. So we are seeing the scale up. Costs are coming down. However, there will be a leap sort of to the next generation of fuels, be those cellulosic biofuels or especially e-fuels that we need to be cognizant of. But yeah, I think Jonathan got it exactly right. Like fundamentally, government has a very important role to play in here. The history to date of voluntary SAF targets has been it's been a dark one. They just did not work because airlines typically they're unwilling to spend pennies per gallon more for fuel, much less dollars per gallon. So I think, especially in the EU and the UK, there's a really good regulatory framework in place that I think can drive progress.
Well, speaking of Europe, does this put your airline, Jonathan, at a disadvantage relative to other airlines?
Well, we don't think so, no, because the SAF mandate is on all uplifted fuel. So it's not just for European carriers or for intra-European. So it's quite different to the emissions trading scheme, which is only for intra-European flying. So it's all uplifted fuel. And so there's no competitive distortion on any given routes. In our view is, yeah, I mean, mandates, they do drive demand. So that's one benefit, but you don't get investment just on mandates alone. That's why you need these complementary incentives to drive the investment. And we've seen some progress here in UK. We've got the revenue certainty mechanism. It's taken a long time, but at least we have a commitment to implement that by fourth quarter next year. Until we get that, we won't get any projects getting to financial close. The EU have likewise, they're putting funds aside through the Innovation Fund, and they have created these SAF allowances that help bridge the price gap between. So I think the policy is beginning to work. I mean, just looking at the volumes, you mentioned gallons, and one of the bugbears we've got is just the metrics on SAF. Liters,
gallons, tones, kilos.
So we say, look, we love diversity in people, but not diversity in metrics. So we like to stick to tons because, and the reason is because we measure CO2 in tons. So if we measure the fuel in tons, we can make that
3 times as much.
Yeah, where we got, I mean, 2021, 100,000 tons, round numbers, 2024, million tons, this year, 2 million tons. So we have seen the scale up. And then ICF, the consultancy company, they put out a report just this week. They suspect we'll be able to get close to 20 million tons by 2030. So still, it's 5% of global supply, but I think that's an indication that we are getting there. IATA, actually at AGM, they produced a report that said it could potentially be 55 million tons by 2030. But what they're including is all the current capacity that produces biodiesel as there's a potential conversion route. As Dan says, though, that's currently using the same feedstocks. So I think we definitely are seeing momentum, but we've still got to complete some of those policy initiatives to make sure these plants get to financial close.
Right. Okay. Good. And then maybe while we're on the subject of SAF and the cost involved and the like, maybe we should talk a little bit about what you guys see in terms of actual financing itself, whether it's for your aircraft, your projects, your SAF. Have you? I know that in the case of Zero Avia, you've had a number of contracts with things like the military and some other investors. I've just misplaced my sheet that had the answer on it. But you've been able, I think, to keep up. You've had a recent equity raise, as I remember. GKN has come in. So I'm just curious, what's it like with investors now for you, Julian? And perhaps you'll have some meetings next week at the Paris Air Show, or maybe there'll be some more announcements here and there. But it'd be just interesting to know how challenging that's been, if at all.
So it's quite interesting, right? Because we are pitching at a completely different angle to what the SAF crowd has to pitch in generally, right? Because our it's a little bit back to what I said earlier, right? Like from everything I'm hearing always about SAF, it's always a cost plus kind of question, right? You always have a cost delta towards conventional jet fuel that you try to kind of circumvent somehow. And there's a lot of project finance essentially. Of course, we have to first develop technology, so certify it, and then roll it out. And we do that kind of at the moment with a nice mix of capital that we've acquired, which I would kind of broadly categorize into 3 groups, right? One is strategic investors. So Airbus comes to mind, for example, with a very clear kind of strategic angle. And in fact, their recent announcement about their hydrogen aircraft, that being pushed back, almost like underlined and kind of highlighted the value of our strategy, because they essentially said, look, we're going to be pushing this back for larger aircraft, because we think some of this stuff like infrastructure has to be proven out on smaller sectors first. And that's obviously what we're targeting first before we then scale up to larger aircraft. So you need these strategic investors are super helpful because they have a more patient mindset, I would say, generally speaking. And obviously, kind of as Jonathan said, a bunch of airlines are among them as well, which is incredibly helpful. The second set then comes in terms of financial investors, and kind of examples are the Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is kind of Bill Gates' climate fund originally. Again, long-term patient capital that sees the long-term view and actually how we reduce carbon emissions globally. And then, last but not least, we also work very closely with governments, right? So both in the US, we've been successful in working with a few of the agencies there. You mentioned the Air Force, but also the FAA, for example. Similarly, in the UK, we've been very thankful, and even in Europe as well, to receive that support. And that's the blend of capital that we're looking to get us through kind of development and certification. And then what we are focusing on now really is how do we get that very first aircraft into service, right? Because that will reduce the risk dramatically for all follow-on investors to then come in. So, Jonathan mentioned the European Innovation Fund. I think that's a great mechanism for doing some of these first-of-a-kind deployments. Similarly, Breakthrough Energy runs a program called the Catalyst that looks at how do you do first-of-a-kind deployments. And I know they've been actually funding some SAF plants. So very, very glad that SAF is breaking down a lot of the barriers in that sense. But, the playbook is there. We have to follow it. And yes, kind of the recent political environment, everything is not making more money available at the moment. But for us, the challenge is just to find the funders that still have an appetite to see this through the current cycle. And I think we're quite confident with that.
I think since you mentioned the Airbus sort of pulling back, and there's obviously universal hydrogen. So I suspect some investors will question hydrogen overall, but as some of those competitors move away permanently, temporarily, perhaps that's an opportunity for Zero Avia. And I note that Dan, ICCT, recently had a paper out.
Can I just, Michael, just on that one again, back to
please.
what Dan said earlier, right? Like it's completely normal that these things happen, right? You have companies that fall by the wayside, and people realize certain approaches are better than others,
right? And
that's okay.
Yeah. Dan, you ICCT put out a paper last week or 2 weeks ago with a California Institute on scaling hydrogen. So I suspect that's one area where I think you guys think there might be an ability to help decarbonize within aviation.
Yes, so that paper took a while to get out. Yes, it was a paper associated with the Hydrogen Hub here in California, looking at the opportunities of scaling hydrogen for aviation. It's been a while since I took a look at that paper, but there is an interesting dialogue here within the US about sort of near-term opportunities for sectors that can absorb new demand from hydrogen versus sort of midterm and long-term. And yeah, I would say, obviously, Julian's doing great work here on developing the actual technology. If you consider sort of how long it takes not just to develop the plane, but also certify it and then roll it into fleets, it's pretty clear that hydrogen is not going to be, sorry, aviation is not going to be the immediate large demand for hydrogen, but potentially a significant mid to long-term demand.
Right. Okay. And maybe, Sandrine, it's a bit of an unfair question, perhaps, but are you, I won't necessarily pick on CFM per se, but for some of the majors, would you expect to see hydrogen at some point to feature in your products or your competitors' products, or do you think that's a step too far for now?
I would say it's a long-term objective, yeah, and even though, as mentioned already or mentioned in some articles, there remain considerable challenge to establish the necessary ecosystem. This is a major area of work and of research for us. So we already performed some tests, like looking at the materials compatibility. We tested the fuel nozzles. We tested single cup canister to visualize the flame, and obviously there will be some challenges, I would say, to overcome on the technical side. Not the but the main challenge, as already mentioned, will be the availability and the price of green hydrogen. So yeah, we this is an area of work, and here I was just talking about the direct hydrogen combustion, and there is also the possibility to use hydrogen in fuel cells, which also opens some possibilities on board of an aircraft. So yeah, it remains a main area of work for us, definitely.
And I guess, Jonathan, you're the user of this stuff. Eventually, you mentioned your investment in Zeravia. Is this something that you focus on, or I mean, you don't have much influence on it per se, right? Because you're flying the aircraft that are out and certified today. But is this something you expect? And maybe I might move that into the next question, because the CEO of Airbus came out already last week or this week saying that he already is looking at the next replacement of the A320 in 12 or 14 years time. Probably too soon for much of this technology, but I'd be curious to know what an airline thinks.
Yeah, I mean, in our sort of 2050 roadmap, we have in terms of hydrogen as direct combustion, be it through fuel cell or directly in the turbine, we think somewhere between 5 and 10% of our emissions reduction in 2050 will come from that technology. It will take longer, and we see it really for commuter regional, potentially for short aircraft, but not for long haul. And then, but of course we see hydrogen will be a critical component for, third generation SAF, power to liquids, eSAF. So we're very supportive of developing a hydrogen infrastructure, because we're going to need it for, as Dan has said today, everything is one generation SAF, it's HEFA. And that's fine in the transition, but we are going to hit feedstock constraints. So the general view is that of the mix by 2050, 20% will be HEFA. You're going to need these more advanced SAFs to make up the 70% of the fuel that we expect by 2050. And that's your alcohol to jets, your municipal solid wastes, but importantly, your power to liquids. This is where you take carbon from the atmosphere and you mix it with green hydrogen. And our view is that up to 50% of all SAF by 2050 will be these third generation SAF. So hydrogen is going to be key to that component.
There was an article this morning, but it was the Wall Street Journal, where they talked about, and this is getting back to the beginning of the conversation, Dan, when we were talking about HEFA. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about using things like corn and soybean in the US, driving up, one, there's land use change. Two, you might be taking food away from humans and animals. So I suspect there should be perhaps a natural limitation to how much HEFA can actually be used. And this actually goes elsewhere too, because we see it in Latin America with food crops there. We see it in Asia with their food crops. We didn't go over this before, but how do you police, maybe this is for Dan, how do you police this stuff? Like, how do you make sure, or is it simply impossible that it actually is S as in, sustainable in aviation fuel?
Yes, it's a really tricky question, and a lot of it hinges around the challenges of life cycle assessment, which are these kind of mathematical models we use to try and characterize the greenhouse gas emission reductions of a fuel through its entire production life cycle. Very well developed field, lots of experts, lots of very smart minds on it, but it's really challenging, especially when you have these sort of second order effects like land use change. So I think increasingly the best practice is to use life cycle assessment as a way to create a basic framework for sustainable aviation fuels that distinguishes between the better and the worse feedstocks. And I think really the EU and the UK has gotten it right here. So rather than like try to really calibrate the nitty-gritty details around LCA, they've used LCA as a way to create these eligibility requirements just to get into the system, for example. Refuel EU requires a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to qualify. And that basically screens out a lot of these crop-based biofuels that are of the greatest concern. So I think it's a combination of like doing the right science, but not being too overly reliant on these very complicated models, and just policymakers at a certain level making a judgment call of what's allowed and what's not allowed based upon the best available science.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and building on that, Michael, and that's exactly right. And as well, there are sustainability standards. So both the UK and EU are quite clear which are eligible feedstocks and which aren't. You know, anything that could be used for food that is non-eligible. So that's a good check and balance. So we're not going to buy any SAF because we're not going to get any credit for it through. It won't qualify for the mandate, and you won't get any ETS benefit either. And likewise, palm oil, for instance, we won't take any SAF that is derived from palm oil
At all, even if it's used or
used cooking oil is different, to palm oil. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. One question that going back a bit to the financing side, we have seen, and maybe this is more directed to Jonathan, but others, please feel free to chime in. Dan, you might have some views on this. We have seen sustainability-linked loans and bonds be issued. Airlines in particular, we've seen a few lessors where they issue a loan or a bond called a sustainability-linked loan or bond, and basically you have criteria that the firm must meet in order to get a discount on their financing, or if they don't meet, the coupon steps up, whatever the case. You can structure it however you like. And we saw quite a few of them, about 22 dozen or so in 2023. Last year, there was sort of under 20. The year to date, now we have about 6. So the run rate is showing a decrease. To IAG's credit and your competitor across the channel in France and the Netherlands, you guys have been consistent in issuing sustainable loans and bonds. And I suspect once you start issuing them, it becomes difficult to stop them because people will say, why did you stop them? There might be very valid reasons to stop. But is that something, but we're sort of seeing fewer of those. Is this something you think you will continue to do? Does it make sense? Is it something that, you do for now and you assess in the future?
No, definitely. We will support them. They're, it helps support our carbon intensity performance. So basically the metrics that we use are all carbon intensity related. That's something that captures many of your initiatives. So it includes SAF, but it also includes using more efficient aircraft, right sizing aircraft for routes to get the load factors up. So it helps drive that whole efficiency agenda within your organization. And we just 3 years ago, we introduced, so 10% of the management bonus within IAG is now dependent on carbon intensity performance. So having the sustainability linked loans as well really helps create additional momentum that this is, you get corporate wide. It's incredible how many phone calls I got from various managers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How does that work again? What do I need
Yeah.
to do? So it works. And I'm happy to say that we haven't impacted negatively anybody's bonus to date, but I'm sure at some point that will happen. But it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, we're got down to about 15 minutes or so. We've got a couple of questions, 3 questions now, which we will get to. I think one thing that what we don't have on the panel, and I think they're probably someone we should think about and talk about, and that's the leasing community. And for those that aren't aware, there's about 28,000 commercial aircraft flying around today. Half of them are owned by airlines themselves, and the other 14,000 are owned by lessors or investors. They are increasingly powerful. A lot of the larger ones tend to be investment grade. They do long-term contracts. So I guess my question to the crowd, and maybe I'll start with maybe Julian on this, and then maybe go to Jonathan. When you look at partnerships like lessors, do you find a willing audience? Do you find them being constructive? Is there something you think that lessors can do to help you further? Because I think lessors are probably a bit, in my opinion, a bit underrepresented when it comes to this part of the market.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think it might be. It's a question that you never get right, like outside of really like core aerospace circles like this one. So I appreciate the question. And I think most people, like once we actually go through our customers, right, and the people that actually have kind of deposits for our first engines, a lot of them are lessors. So they definitely drive kind of especially early demand, because I think they can, at least in our case, right, they're definitely taking a more long-term view, and they kind of see demand from all the operators they're serving, and they can kind of like aggregate it, and they see, okay, that's a really, like, they will easily be able to place X number of engines, and therefore they feel comfortable to make that demand. And that demand signal, right, so just as what Jonathan, what you said earlier about the demand signal towards SAF is obviously also very important for us, right? The demand signal from the lessor kind of aggregating a bunch of operators, mission profiles they would want to fly, right, routes they want to place them on, sometimes even concrete, right, geographic boundaries, so that we can start engaging the hydrogen producers and the airports already. That is really helpful, because it A, signals our equity investors, yes, right, there's demand, and B, it signals to the project finance folks that we then speak to finance the hydrogen infrastructure that we will definitely have to build new, right, for the very first aircraft. That, yes, right, there is somebody very credible, and as you said, right, very good investment grade ratings backing it.
Right.
Yeah, and we've seen, building on that, we've seen, we have seen supportive activity from the lessors. I mean, they clearly recognize the criticality of decarbonizing aviation, because it's the future of their industry disappears if you don't have that. And they've been particularly supportive on the advocacy area, particularly around SAF. Everyone recognizes that, and the OEMs, Airbus and Boeing, that this protects their right to deliver, the existing technology. It will improve, but hence their support for SAF. So advocacy is really important. EU taxonomy, this is where we particularly see some important support. The lessors are, at the heart of that conversation. And I think, our view is, despite the pain that is inflicted on the industry, that designed correctly, it will incentivize investment, accelerated investment in decarbonizing technologies. But it's got to be practicable. And I think, we've seen some real howlers there where, for example, brand new aircraft that are clearly more efficient, we've not been able to include them in the taxonomy because they have halon fire extinguishers on board. This is like the tail wagging the dog. So this is where the lessors have helped play, and I think will continue to play a critical role. And of course, they've got much stronger balance sheets than airlines. So even potentially investing in some of the technologies, be it hydrogen fuel cell companies or even SAF companies, hopefully we'd like to see them play a role there as well.
Okay. We've got 10 minutes left. We've got a handful of questions. So I've got one last, well, there's plenty of other questions we didn't get to, I'm afraid, but there's one last question for each of you. And that is twofold. What is the biggest misconception that you think investors and potential equity providers, or investors in general, debt or equity, what's the biggest misconception you think they have when it comes to decarbonization, sustainability, and what excites you the most? What should excite any of the skeptics, the very, very few there are? What should excite the skeptics that are out there? So maybe with that, I'll turn it over to maybe start with Dan, and then we'll open to questions.
Yeah, great, thanks. So it's a bit of a tough one for me. I'm actually not that dialed into sort of the investor community. So maybe I can answer that in a general term. And I'll reframe it as sort of the biggest misconception about climate mitigation from aviation generally. And so I'll try the entertain portion of it here, since I know probably we need a little bit of controversy.
Bring it on.
Ironically, sort of the title of the webinar or this series is rerouting around the aviation transition for climate. I mean, we're about to release a big report updating ICCT's net zero roadmap for latest developments on, not only on the technology side, but also on contrail mitigation. And one of the big conclusions of that report is if you're looking narrowly at sort of what is necessary for aviation to contribute to the Paris Agreement as defined by avoided global warming in 2050, really the overwhelming conclusion actually is that contrail mitigation, either through rerouting or through fuel quality, is actually the biggest opportunity and the lowest hanging fruit. And it has to do with the fact just airlines are already very fuel price sensitive, which means that they're carbon price sensitive. As we've discussed, a lot of these long-term technologies like e-fuels or hydrogen are nascent and will require time to scale. And also CO2 is in essence permanent in the atmosphere once you emit it. I mean, we're working on carbon dioxide removals, but that's also a pretty tough nut to crack. In contrast, contrails, their warming impact is in the order of hours to maybe a day. And we do think that, minor operational changes can dramatically reduce the potential warming from persistent contrails. So really, if you look at it, you crunch the numbers, you work the technology, the emissions models, feed it into a climate model. It really does say very clearly that, on the order of 2/3 of all of the potential avoided warming in 2050 from aviation comes not from greenhouse gases, it comes from contrails. So that's kind of maybe the biggest misconception generally. And that's also where I have the most hope. I mean, we're seeing rapid advancements in not only the contrail science, but also mitigation technologies and airline and pilot and air traffic control enthusiasm for that. So I think that's something we're really going to see rapid advancements in, and it does make me very hopeful.
Okay, good. Maybe after Dan's comment, I want to go to Jonathan and your views on biggest misconceptions and what excites you.
Yeah, I think, and actually it plays to the first question we had there about sustainable aviation fuels. And the misconception is they don't save CO2. Of course, it's in the life cycle.
I have to explain that a lot as well. Yeah,
we get this kind of like, that sounds great. Oh, it's the same CO2 and then most people can't get to the life cycle bit. But so that because I get the conceptually that's that's climate change. Climate change. The beauty of climate change is it doesn't matter where you save the CO2 as long as you do that. And therefore we get accused of an industry of greenwashing. But this is not industry saying this. This is United Nations, ICAO, every government in the world except the life cycle concept of SAF. So I think that's really important. And I guess this is it Professor Mark Jacobson. I mean, he is from the School of Engineering. We tend to see that they don't tend to have a lot to do with SAF. They're more interested in technology. So we tend to see there's a little bit of vested interest when it comes to these types of institutions and SAF. But that I think is the biggest misconception we have to address.
Okay. And Julian, how about you? Biggest misconception and what excites you the most and should excite the skeptics?
I think the biggest misconception that we're facing is obviously, you asked specifically about investors, right? Is they view like kind of certification as this like giant kind of, insurmountable risk almost. And I think the misconception there is just how much the regulators actually do collaborate and how much it is a collaborative process, right, to certify these things. And how much engagement there comes from the regulators, the people that we speak to, right? All the individuals that you actually interact with, they're like, yes, right, we would love to have a really new technology certified. So like, let's make it work. And that is the project they will go like the extra mile for, right? Like work the extra hour for. So in a way, it's both a misconception by investors and I think something that excites me. Otherwise, I think what excites me most, frankly, and what I wish more people could see is just, like literally every week I go out to our hangar, something, a new test rig pops up and a new piece of hardware goes on test. And that should, excite skeptics out there, because that means data is gathered, and we're getting closer and closer to kind of actual like zero carbon aircraft flying as well.
Okay, and Sandrine?
Yeah, when it comes to future engine technologies, the misconceptions that we hear a lot, and it's basically related to the open fund architecture, which is one architecture we are developing as part of our RISE program. And the two major misconceptions are: it cannot be certified, and it will be very noisy. Obviously, it's not true. I don't have time to answer these two concerns. But this is what we hear the most from people when we introduce this kind of concept. And what am I excited about? I'm very excited to be part of these projects, to developing a brand new engine and driving significant reduction in CO2 emissions, because honestly, it doesn't happen so often when you're an engine OEM. And to paraphrase what one of our chief engineering officer said recently, he said that being part of such project is the nirvana, and I could not agree more. This is really, really exciting to be part of the development of a brand new engines and to bring significant reduction in CO2 emissions.
Great, thank you. So we've got just a few minutes left, 3 minutes left. I'm going to go through the question. I guess I was glancing at questions before that the G word came up twice, greenwashing. One, very kindly written by an ISTAT scholarship awardee. How can the consumer play a role in ensuring that sustainable aviation fuel is used, and how do they avoid greenwashing? I think it's a pretty good question.
It is a good question. I'm happy to have a go if you.
Yep.
And I think it is.
Yep.
I think it is important. Language is really important here, and I think it's fair to say there have been some organisations that have been really misrepresenting and overstating. And I think the KLM case is talking about zero emissions flight. We're very, very careful. And I think they recognise that this is why we talk about net zero emissions. And those little differences are really critical. So we support a general move towards much more careful and considered language, and also only make statements where you've got evidence to back it up. Don't just. So we're moving to the PR world now. I think the PR, well, people have recognised that's just not helpful. And really, we have to be and consumers can play a role here by holding their airlines to account. If you think there's something that is you don't support, you don't agree with, or is overstated, let the airline know.
I think the other thing is that there's I believe it's an EU law that came into effect this year that if you're going to make a green claim, I really don't like the word green, but if you're going to make a claim like that, it actually has to be backed up by an independent third party, right? So it becomes much more difficult. So there was an airline in Europe that referred to themselves as the greenest airline. They won't be able to make that claim anymore. So hopefully some of these laws and regulations, as well as self-policing, will make a difference. There was one question, one last question. Someone mentioned about demand, and we had talked a bit about this, Jonathan and Dan. At ICCT, you have written, Dan, on frequent flyer levies. So sort of a demand lever instead of, say, taxes, or perhaps along with taxes on jet fuel. So there's a levy on frequency of travel. And I guess my question to you, Dan, is: do you think, I'm hijacking the question that was asked, do you think that is achievable? And then Jonathan, like the cold hard facts of life, is that something that could actually even be implemented? But maybe I'll start with Dan and then go to Jonathan, and then we can wrap it up from there.
So ironically, when I saw this question and I was taking notes for it, I said, this is going to be the longest answer I give.
But you don't have you can't make
and I
it
don't
that
have
way,
the time. If I can take 2 minutes. So there is a lot of interest, especially in the UK, around this basically progressive taxation of aviation tickets, where a certain person would pay an escalating tax based upon the number of times that they fly in a year. The original focus of that work was actually implicitly to try and suppress demand, in particularly from higher income consumers. That has not been the focus of my organization. We've come at it from the sort of the finance angle, and that is, okay, we know collectively we need to generate something on the order of $200 billion per US per year in order to support the net zero transition. And so let's look at the various taxation instruments that could generate that type of revenue. And so we come at it more from the revenue generation angle. And if you look at the numbers, this idea, frequent flying levy has real merits in terms of generating most of the revenue from the passengers in the countries that have caused most of the problem, right? Have done most of the historical emissions. So it does have merits from that angle. However, there are real implementation questions around sort of fairness of leisure travelers versus business travelers, also privacy, data availability, et cetera. So those are real. Our most recent report, we actually looked at a hybrid system that we think could work a lot better, which would be simply a flat ticket tax, where some of the revenue is then rebated back to flyers at the end of the year. And that actually brings a lot of the benefits in terms of equity that the frequent flying levy would provide without a lot of the complexity. So again, my long answer. There's a lot there, a lot of things to read on our website for people who are
next webinar, we start with that question, but maybe Jonathan, and then we'll wrap it up.
Very quickly. And we wouldn't support demand, and I think the UK government recognises this. Demand management is it's an instrument you start with is not effective. You've got to focus on getting rid of the emissions themselves. That said, we accept there is a demand impact to the net zero transition. So the Sustainable Aviation Carbon Roadmap, with the cost of all of particularly sustainable aviation fuels, and we support carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is a very important mechanism to help incentivize decarbonization. In that roadmap, there's a 14% reduction in demand due to the cost of so there's natural impact but it's because you're investing in solutions. In terms of the carbon pricing that's the mechanism we need to accelerate decarbonisation of the sector. And frequent flyers, they're already through a carbon pricing. They are impacted by carbon because if you fly more, you pay more. This notion of the sliding scale is really complicated. So therefore, and the power of carbon pricing is you have a single powerful, robust carbon price because that sends a stronger signal to make business cases for SAF and low carbon aircraft and so on. If you start then having to overlay, your first ton of carbon is X and your fifth is 5X. Who decides what that is and how you implement it? You can't, that's going to be done unilaterally. I can't think of any government in the world that's going to do that. If they're going to penalise their frequent flyers unilaterally, you're not going to get that globally. So I think let's develop a globally robust carbon pricing mechanism that will penalise frequent flyers. Will naturally have to pay more. I think that's the way we do it. And of course, we do pay in the UK. We do pay air passenger duty, £5 billion a year. We would love to see some of that come back into help decarbonise, and it would help that transition.
We can't say we're going to penalize the frequent traveler. I think the frequent traveler is very much supporting the decarbonization. I think that's how we'll have to spin it.
They will make an increasing contribution through
precisely. And I think that is how we'll have to leave it today. I would very much like to thank all of my panelists, Jonathan Council, Dan Rutherford, Sandrine Lacour, and Julian Renz for joining today. Thank you all to the attendees for joining and listening in today. Very much appreciate it. And a big thank you to ISTAT and Impact for hosting today's event. So with that, thank you very much. And I wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.